On one of the bitter winter nights of 73 BC, a fire burned on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, where a group of ragged men gathered, their eyes fixed on the darkness. They were nothing but a band of escaped slaves, led by a man who would not have been mentioned in the history of Rome were it not for the revolution he was about to ignite. This man was Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator who transformed from a slave to the leader of the largest uprising in the Roman Republic. Despite all the attempts of the Republic to suppress him, the number of rebels continued to grow, instilling terror in the hearts of Roman masters. This was no longer just a simple rebellion that could be easily crushed. The slaves, once considered less than human, proved their ability to use intelligence and military tactics that no one had expected. Spartacus, once just a gladiator, became a symbol of freedom and rebellion, and Rome began to realize that this war would be unlike any other. The beginning. The slave revolt in Campania. The revolt erupted in the Campania region, the favorite vacation spot for wealthy Romans. These green lands and luxurious villas, which embodied dreams of comfort and relaxation, quickly turned into a battlefield. Initially, Roman authorities did not take this rebellion seriously, thinking it was just a wave of thefts and looting by a gang of runaway slaves. But Spartacus and his men were planning something much bigger. Rome summoned a military force led by Gaius Claudius Glaber, a Roman praetor, to crush this rebellion. Glaber gathered about 3,000 men, but they were not trained soldiers. Rather, they were a militia hastily assembled, as Rome did not consider this uprising worthy of using the regular Roman legions. Glaber's forces surrounded the slaves at the summit of Mount Vesuvius and blocked the only route they could descend. The plan seemed simple: wait for the slaves to run out of food and force them to surrender. But Spartacus had other ideas. His men were not trained for war, but they possessed extraordinary intelligence. The slaves cut vines and trees on the slopes of Vesuvius, crafting ropes and ladders, which they used to descend from the mountain on the other side, away from the eyes of the Roman army. In the darkness, they quietly maneuvered around the base of the mountain and attacked Glaber's forces from behind, achieving a stunning victory that astonished everyone. Consecutive victories and the defeat of the praetors. Spartacus's first victory was not a fleeting event. It marked the beginning of a series of victories achieved by the slaves against Roman forces. After Glaber's defeat, Rome sent a second campaign led by the praetor Publius Varinius to fight the rebels. Once again, the Romans made a strategic mistake when Varinius divided his forces into two units led by his subordinates Furius and Cassinius. This decision proved unwise, as Spartacus was able to exploit it skillfully. He concentrated his forces first on defeating Furius and his troops, then swiftly turned to Cassinius's forces. Cassinius was killed in battle, and Varinius himself nearly fell into captivity. The rebels seized military equipment from both armies, and these consecutive victories increased Spartacus's popularity among the escaped slaves and local shepherds who joined him. The expansion of the rebellion and its peak. By the end of 73 BC, the number of Spartacus's forces had swelled to about 70,000 men. The rebellion was no longer just a small insurrection. It had become a powerful and organized army. The slaves spent the winter training, arming themselves, recruiting more slaves and shepherds, and launching attacks on cities such as Nola, Nuceria, Thurii, and Metapontum. In one of these battles, Spartacus lost one of his prominent leaders, Unamios, who was killed under mysterious circumstances, and his memory faded from history. However, despite this loss, the slaves continued to advance, relying on Spartacus's cunning and leadership. The growing danger. The Republic's concern. As Spartacus's victories increased, Rome began to realize that this rebellion was not merely a wave of thefts and looting, as they had initially thought. The situation was heading towards open war. The rebellion was no longer confined to rural areas. It had spread to encompass entire cities and towns. The slaves were no longer just a defensive force. They began to launch organized attacks on Roman targets, prompting the authorities to take more serious measures. It became clear that Rome needed a professional military force to eradicate this growing rebellion. The Senate was in a state of increasing anxiety, and although this revolution had not yet threatened the heart of the Republic, it represented a rising threat that needed to be extinguished before the situation worsened. Crassus moves. Rome's last hope. As the threat posed by Spartacus and his army grew, Rome decided to assign the task of crushing the rebellion to General Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of great ambitions and ruthless cruelty. Crassus was known to be one of the richest men in Rome, but he aspired to achieve the military glory that was lacking to match Pompey and Julius Caesar. Crassus led 8 legions of trained soldiers and began moving toward southern Italy, where Spartacus was bolstering his forces. Crassus knew that Spartacus had become a real danger to the Republic, so he decided to employ harsh tactics to crush this rebellion. The final confrontation. The fall of Spartacus. In the meantime, Spartacus had become a legend among slaves and commoners, and his army had swelled to include thousands of soldiers fleeing from the bonds of slavery. Spartacus tried to escape to northern Italy to reach safer areas, but Crassus's forces were surrounding him on all sides. Eventually, the decisive confrontation took place near the Silarus River. This was the last battle for the slave army. Spartacus and his men fought with unimaginable bravery, but they were facing a well-organized and better-armed army. Spartacus fell on the battlefield, his body disappearing among thousands of dead, making it impossible to find him. After the fall of Spartacus, the end of the revolution and its consequences. After the fall of Spartacus, the revolution was finally crushed. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning against any future uprisings. However, despite the eradication of the rebellion, the revolution had left a deep mark on Rome. The Republic had demonstrated its military power and cruelty to the world, but at the same time, the revolution exposed the fragility of a system based on slavery. Spartacus was not merely a leader of a rebellion. He became a symbol of hope and courage in the face of injustice.